Whenever you're ready,
Yeah, Carrie-Ann, are you able to continue letting people in, please? All right, everyone seems to be slowly filtering in. We have, our time has started, so I'm going to start with the introductions. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for webinar 2, Basic Hydrology and Understanding of Flow, Community Perspectives from Oneida First Nation of the Thames. My name is Emily Amon, and I'm the Water Programs Lead for Green Communities Canada, joining you all today from Salt Spring Island, BC, the traditional territories of the Ho'okuminam and Senkotan speaking peoples. This webinar is the second in the series of 5 weekly webinars we are producing to share information about the floodplain mapping project that took place with Chippewas of the Thames First Nation along Deshkan-Zibi, also known as the Thames or Antler River. Our next webinar will be at the same time and link next week. So please mark it in your calendars, and we hope to see you there as well. Please note your mic is muted for the presentation today to try to cut out any background noise. We are also recording today's session, and you can find the YouTube link for last week's session in the chat box already. For anyone unable to attend, they can view this session at a later time. Today's session focuses on basic hydrology and monitoring protocols for watershed management, and looks at some of the community perspectives from Oneida First Nations. We welcome any feedback that you may have in the chat box, and we also have a survey link which has also been posted in the chat. We have some extra time that we've incorporated into today's session for questions at the end. So if you'd like to stay on after the formal presentations have completed, we will have some time for Q&A. And we've pasted the answers to some asked questions in the chat box for today's session. Please take a moment to say hi in the chat and name the community or organization you're from. That just gives us a better opportunity to know who's with us today. And that's all from me. So I'll turn it over now to Courtney Riley for our traditional Q&A.
Bonjour, Kipwaynish Nikas, Nimkipinasi and Dodem. Leshkan Zibing Don Jabal, Jabwaynish Nabe Quaindao, Courtney Riley, Shaganashi knows when. My spirit name is Springwater Woman. I hail from the Thunderbird clan, and I'm from Chippewas Thames First Nation, or also known as Deshkan Zibi. And my English name is Courtney Riley. I'm sitting here today again at the Fork of the Thames, and I've been asked to do an opening prayer and song. So I'll start with a prayer, and then I'll talk a little bit about the song. Miigwech Kajamnado, Gimi's young Mino Gishgat Nangom. Miigwech Kajamnado, Mino Bamazuan. Miigwech Kajamnado, Kinagago Gajitoyan. Miigwech Mishomaskizis, so give you a sitrang no. Miigwech Nokumaskizis, so give you a sitrang debitkan. Miigwech Shkakmikwe, Gimi's young Nesewen, Gimi's young Nipe, Gimi's young Matagog, Gimi's young Lisiap, Gimi's young Nungok. Asima Biginang, Wabanong, Jawanong, Epigashmak, Minwa, Giwadenong, Madamotionong, Wijuwishnong, Kinagago, Ashtigayang, Niga, Nikea, Pane, Miwane, Miigwech. So I am very much a language learner myself and have been working on doing my introduction and an opening prayer. So for the benefit of those who are also learners, the English version of that is I was just thanking Creator for another beautiful day. And thank you, Creator, for this beautiful life. And thank you, Creator, for everything that you do for us. Thank you, Grandfather Sun, for shining on us today. And thank you, Grandmother Moon, for shining on us tonight. Thank you, Mother Earth, for giving us air, for giving us water, for giving us the trees, for giving us the animals, and for the stars. I offer my tobacco to the four directions, the east, the south, the west, and the north, and asking that you help and be with us in everything that we do. And just humbly and most respectfully, thank you. So I'm going to start off with a welcoming song, and this song was shared with me by my friend Dr. Eva Jewell, where she learned it from when she was in her studies, and she was given permission to share this song. So the welcoming song, it just says Being Again Anishinaabe, so it's just saying to come in. And I guess a little bit about this song is it can be used for opening up gatherings, welcoming people into your community. I was also able to share this song when my nephew was born, and they say that when our children are in the mother's bellies, that they're hearing the heartbeat of the mother the whole time, and so transitioning from the spirit world into the physical world can be a quite traumatic experience. And so, as you can imagine, and so they say that if we can mimic the drum or the mother's heartbeat, that it'll help for that spirit to feel more safe in coming into this world. And so when my nephew was born, I was able to offer up this song to him just to let him know, welcome into this world, welcome into our family, and that it is a safe place that he's coming into. So here's the song.
Miigwech, Courtney, for another awesome opening. Anin Bojo, Minogijigan, Carrie Charles Dishnakaz, Ashunyan Dunjipa, Mayangan Dodam, Anishna Bakwa and Dao. Hello, my name is Carrie Ann. I am from Georgina Island First Nation, also known as Shining Waters or Lake Simcoe. I am of the Wolf Clan and I am a Anishinaabe woman. I'm the Environment Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services, and I will be your moderator for this series. Being again. Welcome. As mentioned by Emily, we have a full agenda today, and this is the second of 5 webinars that we've developed through the project called Flood Plain Mapping and Integrated Watershed Management with the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, a shared watershed with a shared responsibility and an educational journey. This project has been funded by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada through their ADAPT program. If you are joining us for the first time, we've had the privilege of working with all 4 communities that are situated within the Lower Thames watershed, including the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, who is the lead community, Oneida of the Thames Nation, Munsee Delaware Nation, and Delaware Nation of Moravian Town, along with many awesome project partners as represented on the top of the slide deck, in which you can learn more about on the registration page. We also had others such as the City of London and the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority share knowledge as well as commit to continuing to work together to protect and preserve that in which sustains us all. This is a phased project, and phase 2 is the project that we are here to share with you throughout this series. As mentioned in the first webinar, this project is a great example of Albert Marshall's two-eyed seeing and Reg Crowfoot's ethical space concept being actioned. The intention of this project has been to assist the 4 communities in understanding not only the importance of undertaking floodplain mapping work, but also understand the methodology and processes from the Western perspectives, including the effects of climate change. It has also been designed to create opportunities and encourage the community members to share their perspectives and knowledge so that can be ingrained into the work being carried out, as well bring valuable insight and holistic views to the perspectives of the non-Indigenous project partners. These webinars have been developed with these same intentions and are geared to Indigenous communities, as well as those non-Indigenous folks that are undertaking this type of work, but also any environmental initiative. As noted, these sessions all have pretty full agendas and there may not be a lot of time for questions. So we ask that you please type your questions in the chat box. And if we cannot get to them today, we will have answers for you next week in next week's webinar. If you can notice, we have posted chat in the chat box, questions from last week and some answers to those questions. So with that, next slide, please, Em. I would like to invite Jason Wintermute to start us off with the first presentation from this session. So take it away, Jason.
Thank you. We see there's a good mix of people here today. Some of them have quite a bit of technical knowledge, some not quite so much. So we're going to start with a basics of hydrology presentation that just kind of goes over the concepts of hydrology. And let's begin. First slide. So what causes flow in the river? You know, at its most simple, rain falls on the land, which eventually makes its way to the river and is carried away. The more rain that makes it to the river, the more flow is created. And the faster the rain makes it to the river, the more quickly and higher the river rises. Snow acts as rain stored on the land, and when it melts, it adds to any water that's there through rain or for melt. Next slide. So what happens to the water once it reaches the land? Well, it gets stored on the land in puddles, ponds, wetlands, other natural areas, or it could run across the ground into our water courses and make their way to a larger river. Or it can go into the ground where it stays in the soil. It can move down into deep aquifers where we get extracted from wells, or it can move through the ground towards a close by river. And it's the second one, the overland runoff, what we call it, that causes rivers to rise quickly and create higher flows. Next slide. So how does what's on the landscape affect this? So natural areas, especially wetlands, tend to hold on to the water and store it for later, or allow it to infiltrate into the ground. This reduces the amount of runoff, reducing the high flows and reducing flooding. In addition, natural areas provide countless other benefits. Next. Agricultural areas are a bit different. They have their natural features removed. The water can still infiltrate into the ground, but the ability to store any water for later is lost. Once the ground becomes saturated, the extra water just runs off. And in agricultural areas with tile drainage, the tiles can speed up the movement of water through the ground as well. Next. So urban areas have lost, all their natural features and have also covered up much of the ground. There are roads, sidewalks, rooftops, all these features that simply won't let water enter the ground. So in these areas, the water runs off very quickly, and it can cause much higher flows and faster rising rivers. Next. So how do we attempt to manage the flows? A big one is we try to do it through dams. What dams do is they try to provide the storage function that the natural areas had, but they put it all at a single point. This can reduce the high flows on the rivers that pass through the dam by temporarily storing the water in a reservoir. In addition, some dams, if they're managed properly, can also provide additional water to the river during drier summer months and to boost the flow. Next. Another thing we attempt to use to manage flows is stormwater management. So stormwater management tries to manage the excess water caused by urbanization closer to the source. And the most common example is to add storage with stormwater management ponds. You can see here on the right an example. They attempt to ensure that peak flows coming off the development are not greater than they were before development. But it doesn't necessarily mimic the entire hydrologic function that we had there. Next slide. So we also try to attempt to restore the natural flow patterns. And the way we're doing that is low impact development. This is an innovative stormwater management approach that attempts to mimic the natural movement of water even closer to where the rain falls. It uses simple design techniques and landscape features that allow water to be filtered, to infiltrate, and to get stored. Low impact development projects can range from smaller, simple, low-cost ones that people do at home, all the way to major works that address significant development impacts. Next. Common examples around your home would be rain barrels, rain gardens, permeable pavements, infiltration trenches or chambers, or green roofs. These are some examples. Some other benefits low impact development provides, rather than just stormwater management, is it can also improve or protect water quality. It can provide cost savings for urban infrastructure, and it provides healthier communities with the plant life and the other things that it supports. Next. We can also attempt to renaturalize the landscape. We can plant trees, we can create or recreate, back slide please, recreate wetlands or plant forests, things like that. Next slide. Yep, here we go, or plant buffer strips along water courses. In Ontario, conservation authorities and other organizations, all over the world have programs to help those who want to renaturalize the landscape. Next. So how do we monitor, the hydrology and the flows in the river and what's going on? We need to know what's going on, and primarily we need to monitor both precipitation in the form of rain and snow, and the flows in the river watercourse ourselves. Obviously, range gauges tell how much rain has fallen, and snow cores tell us how much water is stored in the snow. Manual stream flow measurements not only tell us how much flow we have, but the information can also be used to develop relationships between, say, river depth and flow, so that we can use things like automated gauge stations to help us out. And computer models can also help with predicting and forecasting and things like that. So, next. So rain gauges are fairly common. Basically, they tell us how much rain has fallen and also how fast it's fallen, which can be quite important. The most common ones are called tipping buckets. And when a specific volume is reached in a tipping bucket rain gauge, it, quote, tips and empties. And these number of tips are counted, and that gets converted into a total rainfall depth. Other devices will weigh the precipitation, and this works a lot better if you're trying to measure something like snow. Next. So snow gauging, most of Canada, we have significant snow. Once the snow has fallen, we need to keep track of how much is still there, and also how much water the snow is storing. To do this, we take snow cores. You have to take them various places around the watershed. And essentially what you do is you have a hollow tube with a specific diameter that you insert into the ground, and then it captures the snow. Then you can weigh the snow to determine how much water is still on the ground. And the snow depth also helps us determine how dense the snow is, because when the snow reaches a certain density, it can't hold any more water, and then it starts to release all that water. Next. So another place that we're starting to get this kind of information is through volunteer networks, where in addition to data collected by various agencies, municipalities, First Nations communities, individuals themselves can also help collect this information and provide it. For example, there's an organization called COCORAS. It's a grassroots volunteer network of basically people who have backyard setups, and they take measurements of snow and precipitation, and then it gets mapped. People with automatic stations can also, link up to various websites like WonderMap, for example, and have their data posted online for everyone to see. And these can be very helpful in areas where the agencies, don't have the resources to put more sophisticated equipment in place. Next slide. So now on to how we measure flows. Using flow meters, and the most simple are just these instruments with propellers on them, or more advanced techniques, for example, acoustic devices, which use sound waves to measure the flow. Using these kind of devices, we can directly measure the velocity of the water in the river, and then through that, how much flow is going on. With enough measurements taken across the river and at various depths, you can kind of sum it all up to figure a total stream flow for the river. Next slide. Then, given enough manual stream flow measurements, you can develop a relationship between river depth and the flow. And using that, you can create automatic gauge stations that use floats or pressure systems. And then these will basically measure the depth, and through the relationship you've developed, that gets converted to a flow. And this allows us to much more quickly and much more safely collect the flow information we need, especially at higher flows. Next slide. And then we have computer models. Computer models can be developed to estimate what the flow in the river might be based on the precipitation that falls and various other factors. The models typically require good information about the climate, especially how much precipitation was there, but also information about the land cover type, the soil properties, and the drainage network that exists. The models can sometimes be quite complex and require good data going into them to produce good results. And oftentimes getting the spatial coverage that we need for that input data can be a challenge, which again is why sometimes those volunteer networks and things like that can be very helpful. Next slide. So this session is about floodplain mapping. And so how does this hydrology discussion tie into floodplain mapping? Well, by analyzing the flows of the river, we can determine what the probability of a specific flow occurring is. And then we have to choose a probability of occurrence and a corresponding flow in order to map. And so once we've done that, these flows are put into another type of model called a hydraulic model, which we will discuss in future sessions. And that can be used to determine what the water level on the landscape will be. And then from there, once we know how high the water gets in the landscape, from there we create mapping. Okay, next. So that's it for my basics of hydrology discussion. Thank you very much.
Kalimainder kung ka igawan izad neo handun kalibadekar akwego oskajendo khwenu ni gwanigo ya dates na faladun tandido na khweladun ganjo nani tone tagin gwanigo Agwego skajim do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladin. Kino ha ohanja Chisegu Kadoga New Dinigo Food Tani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajim do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates no poladu. Ganyo desawa he Chisegu Kadoga New Dinigo Food Tani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajim do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladu. Oyem guau. Chisegu I don't stay Manigato Gistage do the Hunji. Chisegu Kadoga New Dinigo Food Tani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajin do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladu. Jun hek asanati gundahunde was a hate onaste was a hater kalay on was a gator. Dani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajin do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladu. Onum quat. Chisegu Kadoga New Dinigo Food Tani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajin do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladu. Candilio so Canicalio Daza Nilocalio Duana Zayagani ha. Gisegu Kadoga New Dinigo Food Tani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajin do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladu. Galundesum. Canicalio Daza Nile Galunduana Zayagani ha. Wata Nicolondo that go Guanji Segun Gadoga New Dinigo Food Tani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajin do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladu. Of Neganas. So now we'll look at Guana Zayagani ha. Neoni Tos go to Compadu Ganjasum. Gani Ganjaza Nile Ganjoana Zayagani ha. Chisegu Kadoga New Dinigo Food Tani Tournament having Guanigo. Agwego skajin do khwet nunin guanigo ya dates in poladu. Ojida Hatsum. Gani Kajitasa Nile Kajitawana Zayagani ha.
What he just recited is what we call our Kanohuela Dunksla, or our Thanksgiving address. In the beginning, he says, and so what that means is that it comes before all other matters. And the other wording that is repeated throughout his opening is and what that means is that we're going to bundle our minds together as one. And so the thinking of our older people was that as we come together and we're gathering our minds, in our spirits, we're coming from different places, we're coming from different territories, but we all have this one objective, I guess, today, this thing that we're going to talk about in dealing with our environment. And so that's what our opening is designed to do, is to bring everybody's minds together as one. And he acknowledged our people first, everybody that was able to come together, everybody that was able to gather, and also in our community that there was a passing. And so we just want to acknowledge that and pray for the family, that has suffered a loss. And so we acknowledge each other, we acknowledge our families, we acknowledge our communities. And then he goes on to acknowledge creation, and we start with the earth, our mother, and then he mentions everything that was placed here in the beginning by the Creator to benefit human beings here on earth, right from the waters to the berries, the medicines, our food sustenance, our medicines, the trees, the birds, the waterways and the fishes, the things that live within the water, the birds. And he begins with our grandfathers, the Thunders, who will be getting ready to start their job and bring the rains back to this area and shake up the earth and wake creation up again, to start things over again for this next cycle. And then he mentioned the sun, our eldest brother, the sun, who brings light and energy into this world. And then our grandmother, the moon, who has a big responsibility as well, that she works with the waters and she helps us to guide us, helps and guides us as to when we conduct our ceremonies. And she also helps to bring new life into this world.
Thank you, Jason. A lot of information to soak in, but you did a great job of summarizing and making it understandable. The community perspective you viewed just now, given by Guy and Toke and his father, we felt was an important aspect to share with you. It is so great to see such a young man speak so fluently in his language about such important understandings, and the support and encouragement it is given by his dad really demonstrates the Indigenous values. With that, we have up next Chris Tasker from the Upper Thames Conservation Authority to give our next presentation. So over to you, Chris.
Well, thanks very much for this opportunity to talk today to the group about flooding in the Upper Thames River watershed. If you could advance to the next slide, please. So this slide gives a brief outline of what I hope to cover. It's a condensed version of a presentation given at a previous workshop. So there's a lot of info on each slide, and I'll try and focus on a key concept or two in order to get through it in the next 10 minutes. Next slide, please. So a few words about the Upper Thames River watershed. Conservation authorities are based on naturally defined watersheds. And Jason did a pretty good job or great job actually of describing that area. And the watershed really is the area drainage area that contributes to the flow at a given point on a watercourse. In the case of the Upper Thames, its watershed is that which contributes flows on the Thames River to a point just downstream of Delaware, which is basically where the Thames River flows under Highway 402. And people often ask why the Thames River is separated into the upper and lower watersheds. And unfortunately, the answer to that is politics. When the municipalities in the Thames watershed got together to consider forming a conservation authority, the initial vote failed. However, in assessing the support for a conservation authority being formed, there was lots of support in the upper part of the watershed and not much in the lower part of the watershed. A second meeting was called for those municipalities in the upper watershed, and the UTRCA was formed in 1947. The municipalities in the lower watershed did not form a conservation authority until 1961. In addition to this political difference, the hydrology of the two watersheds are slightly different. In the Upper Thames watershed, it's characterized by many branches of the watercourse, similar to the tines of an antler. The flows tend to concentrate as these branches contribute more and more water as it progresses down through the Upper Thames. But then as it flows down through the Lower Thames, the peaks tend to lessen as they move downstream, and the water is stored in the broad floodplains. Also, the tributary watercourses in the Lower Thames have peaked and moved downstream a little before the flows from the upper watershed move through the Lower Thames. Next slide, please. So I'd like to spend a couple minutes on what we were initially referring to as the Thames River Clearwater Revival. And this was an effort to reconnect with the river and renew partnerships to focus community effort on a healthy and vital Thames River. It involved a broad partnership of First Nations, federal and provincial ministries, the two conservation authorities in the watershed. It included very active participation from the City of London, who was instrumental in bringing many of these partners to the table. Next slide, please. This water management plan is part of a broader water management strategy, and efforts were directed to updating the Thames River Basin Study, which was of 1975. The effort through the involvement of the partners, including the First Nations, is now referred to as the Shared Waters Approach. The broader watershed management strategy includes many different parts at different scales, and recognize that you won't be able to read the text on the diagram or the graphic on the right, but it shows many of those different parts, and these occur at different scales, some at a community level, some at a conservation authority level, and some at a provincial, federal, or even international level. Next slide, please. So the First Nation communities which participated in this shared waters approach developed their own goals and mission statement. As you can see from the mission statement, they focus on the importance of Indigenous traditional knowledge and improving involvement and awareness. Each of these goals that are identified above resulted in many recommendations. Next slide, please. The mission statement and goals and recommendations were also developed for both water quantity and water quality. My involvement was with the water quantity aspect, and I'm going to focus on that today as it includes the flood flood risk concept that we're talking about. In addition to flood risk, however, this effort also considered environmental flow requirements, and this will be a challenging aspect to understand and improve those environmental flow requirements for the many different uses of the shared resource, the water in the watercourse. Monitoring of flows is a very important aspect of the plan, and Jason has already spoken to that aspect, and it's recognized in this plan as well. Next slide, please. So the historical flooding is a very important part of understanding the flood risks in a particular area. The flood of 1937 was the worst on record in the Thames River. Often floods are felt at different severities in different parts of the watershed, and this was the worst in the south branch of the Thames at a gauge which we refer to as the Ealing gauge in London, which is just east or just upstream of the forks of the Thames. It was determined to have a probability of occurring in any given year as 0.4%, which equates to a flood which would happen on average once every 250 years. This flood was the driving force behind the creation of the UTRCA, the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, and it's used as a regulatory flood standard to redirect development away from the floodplain, which would flood under that particular event. Next slide, please. So there are a number of flood damage centers in the Upper Thames watershed. They're mainly focused around the developed areas, the urban areas, but there's many different types of floodings, and Conservation Authority focuses on river-based flooding. UTRCA doesn't have any Great Lakes shorelines, so we don't have the issues that the Lower Thames and most of the other conservation authorities have with regard to Great Lakes flooding. The other types of flooding, localized flooding due to overland flow, ditches, stormwater management, sewer backups are aspects that are more of a municipality or community focus. Our flood damage centers, as I mentioned earlier, are generally those urbanized areas where historically development has built within the floodplain in areas like London, Ingersoll, Woodstock, Stratford, and St. Mary's. Also, trailer parks with seasonal or permanent dwellings have become very significant flood damage centers in many of the municipalities in the watershed. Riverine flooding also results in frequent road closures and the closure of recreational parks and trails and other types of amenities. Municipal flood coordinators need to be aware of these and communicate with the Conservation Authority so that appropriate warnings may be issued. Next slide, please. So that communication happens through our flood forecasting and warning program, where the Conservation Authority continuously monitors the watershed conditions, many of those things that Jason had mentioned in the earlier presentation, including the stream gauges, precipitation gauges, snow courses, and of course, weather forecasts. Based on all this information, we were able to issue bulletins to the municipal flood coordinators. These bulletins are also provided to the local First Nations communities, which are just downstream of that watershed boundary, as I was referring to earlier. They're in the Lower Thames, but immediately downstream of the Upper Thames. So we provide them with these bulletins as well. These bulletins use similar terminology all across Ontario. All the conservation authorities in the province use similar terminology, and it's also similar to the weather watches and warnings issued by Environment Canada. Next slide, please. So we operate a number of flood control structures and maintain those structures to mitigate flood risks for existing development. I'll discuss the operation of dams and reservoirs in the following slide. But in this slide, I'll focus on channels and dikes and flood walls, which are another way existing development can be protected from some of the flood risks. None of these flood control structures is seen as an opportunity to allow new development in these flood-prone areas. Flood risk is such that these structures are not able to fully protect the flood-prone areas. Due to the nature of flooding, they'll be surpassed at some point in time. The dikes in London were overtopped in 1937 flood, and while they have been raised and improved since, we're currently working with the City of London to rehabilitate them to current standards. However, there will always remain a risk that a larger event will occur. Next slide, please. So the dams that Jason mentioned earlier in the presentation are operated to take water into storage in the reservoirs during times when the flows are higher and hold it until it can be released when flows are lower. They're operated in this way during a flood event to let less water out than is coming in as the flows increase and peak. But once the peaks have passed and started to recede, the water is slowly released over the following days as shown in the top graph, reducing the flood flows and the damages accordingly downstream. Over the year, the same principle is used to allow us to take water into storage during the spring when flows are high, thereby reducing flood damage during that period. But then we hold onto that river or onto that water until the summer and fall when the flows tend to be lower, and we're able to release it to improve the stream flow during the drier summer months. Next slide, please. And this brings us, or me, to the last slide in my presentation, which just points out that our current focus that we have right now is focusing on updating our flood models to be able to better understand flooding. As these models are developed, they may then be used initially for the regulatory mapping that I referred to earlier, which is intended to steer development away from those flood-prone areas. And then a later focus will be to better illustrate more frequent flooding, assess mitigation measures, and the impacts of climate change. And that brings me to the end of the slide, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about flooding in the Upper Thames.
Scully, yung sanawi niyo ang get sa tahuni niyo ang get a lodo on your daga niyo go 100 from Oneida Nation of the Thames. I'm just really excited to be here and hearing all the wonderful work and sharing in the responsibility of taking care of the water. So how can we take care of the water when we basically drive over the bridge over the water, but we don't have any contact with the water? So Brandon has done a lot of things to try and help us get access to places where we can put our tobacco in the water and pray for the water and just have access to our water again. We're trying to wake up and share with our youth that the responsibilities, we don't have a right to fresh water. We have a responsibility to that water to do our best to keep it clean and to help it stay that way, to provide that nutrients. Like our brains are 75% water, and we need to be grateful that the water that we have are still doing a lot. They're still doing what they were put here on this earth to do.
Miigwech, Chris, for that great overview. You did well to cover a lot of information in such a short period of time. And another Oneida community perspective that we felt was important to share to ensure that context of the Indigenous perspective. With that, last but not least, we have Mark Peacock to give our final presentation of the session. The floor is yours, Mark.
Thank you, Carrie Ann, and I hope everybody can hear me. It's really important, I think, to provide some of the work that we did, excuse me, so you can see how we put together information on how much water, what is the peak flow, what is the community going to look to in protecting itself too. So the overall picture is we have 4 sources of information that we're using. There is the traditional knowledge from the community. Very, very important piece. In many ways, it was our marching orders. When we talked to the community and the elders of the community and the leaders of the community, there were certain things they told us to look at. The next thing we can look at is the stream flow records, the information off the gauges that both Chris and Jason were talking about. Finally, we can then look also at modeling, and I'll go through some of the approaches that we are looking at, some of the important things you might want to consider if you're looking at your nation doing work in hydrology. And finally, historic events, much like the type of work that Chris once again talked about, the historic events that are critical to the Thames River. Next slide, please. So what did we learn from the community? The first main piece was, in the past, the large flows are in the spring. That is the knowledge of the community. However, they have voiced significant concerns around climate change, that this may be changing. The flows are changing in the river, not only when those flows are occurring, but how much. So there was a major flow last fall, which is very rare when talking to the nations. That all of a sudden brings a whole bunch of questions, excuse me, into the analysis that we call hydrology. The other two other things that came up was a very clear statement that as settlers populations, we need to be more responsible for the water. We need to be responsible how much comes down to the river and understand that in the way we develop our communities. And finally, there were a number of issues around local drainage, the smaller streams indigenous that flood homes and basements and roads. It needs to be considered. It's not part of this, but it was a main point that came out in the discussions with community members. Next slide. So we talked about stream gauges. So when you take on a project like this, you need to look at where the stream gauges are in your watershed. Maybe even, well, not only maybe, but look at the stream gauges in your regional area as well. And I'll tell you why as we go through. Next slide. You need to look at trends. You need to look at what is happening with the water in those gauges, whether there are trends and whether the things that are talking to you through the statistics about what the community is experiencing. So those analysis need to be done, and that was done as part of this project. Next slide. So how do we do that analysis? We do the single station frequency analysis. So we take a look at a gauge and we try to understand that. But we also do regional frequency analysis, where we look at gauges over a large area using different analysis methodologies to see if those gauges tell us more about the river and about more about the changing conditions in the region. And finally, we look at the historical studies, that item D in that flow chart you saw. We look to those studies to help inform, as well as the analysis of the actual data in the gauges. Next, please. So precipitation is really important, and where precipitation is going. And there are all kinds of tools available to look at that. In Ontario, we have provincial tools. Climate Atlas of Canada, there are published reports. The other thing is to look in your area. Western University has done certain number of different studies and developed tools. Those are available for us in our area. But look to your area and see if there are things that can help tease out this climate change issue. It won't be definitive probably, because you can only go so far, but it's something you have to address. And it's something the community said that we had to address. Next slide. So modeling, very important piece when you're looking at climate change, because you don't have data, you're trying to predict into the future. And what do you use in predicting into the future? You use the models that you have. So we use historic data from those gauges to calibrate and validate our models. Calibrating is making sure the parameters in the model give us a reasonable answer. Validation is confirmation of that calibration. And then we start simulating new events. We look at going forward with different climate scenarios, and we look at what would result. Next slide, please. Here's an example. Never over model, only model for what you need. Very important that you really think about what it is, the question you're trying to answer. The model we used was very simple, 2-basin lumped model, and it's very straightforward. Because it did what we wanted to do. You only need to be as complicated with modeling as the answer ask it. So the answer that has to be competent and it has to be reliable, reasonable, but it doesn't have to be overcomplicated to get there. Next slide, please. So we use all kinds of different data in our models. We use spatial data, like what the ground is. Many of the things that Jason Wintermute talked about in the overall hydrology, we consider those elements in the model. We look at time series data, which is how much rain is falling during a particular event, all those types of things. And then we use the stream flow data to compare our results of the model. So there's lots of information. And really what you want to do is you want to get lots of data and you want to get the appropriate data so that you can answer the question with regards to the flow that you're looking to understand. Next slide. So this is examples of the results of that and their calibration results from different simulations of flow at one of the gauges. Next slide. One of the things we also do is we run models of actual events, and then we compare those models against the historic data. Some of this is a little bit less reliable. It's older data, but it gives us yet one more check with regards to as we answering the question of what is the flow, what is the standard of care, what is that flow that the community wishes to consider. Now, with the settler populations, we have all kinds of provincial rules about what those flows are. With the First Nation, the intent is to provide that First Nation a whole bunch of ideas about that and allow the First Nation to consider what they want to protect their nation to. So we're providing that background for the First Nations decision. Next slide. So out of that comes a whole bunch of flows. And it may be the highest flow or whatever, but we present those flows to the nation. We make recommendations of what that flow might be so that we can take the next step, which is the hydraulics model, which will tell us how much land is covered by the flow. So this is the type of the end result of the hydrology piece of the study. But I think it's important that you look at all kinds of different scenarios. So the First Nation has the ability to make some decisions around what they want and how they want to protect their community. Next slide. That's it. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, Sagali Swagweg, Brandon Dockstader and Yungits, Ogwali ni Wagid Load, Onyet Agung Wehuene. So my name is Brandon Dockstader. I'm from the Oneida Nation of the Thames, Bear Clan. My Oneida name is Lutseal, which means he's shy. And so the last term I wanted to talk about was pan-Indigenous. This is a political approach meant to create a one-size-fits-all framework to deal with different First Nations, Métis, and Inuit groups in Canada. And I like to bring this up because within this context that we're talking about here, we have three distinct nations. We have the Chippewa, the Thames, who are Anishinaabe, the Delaware, who are Lenape, and Oneida Nation of the Thames, Onyida, Haudenosaunee. And so though we all live close to each other, we have different cultural customs, laws, jurisdiction, and languages. And so it's important that we don't take a one-size-fits-all, because one thing that may work in one community isn't going to work in another community. And it's finding those ways to be adaptive. Teresa and Gayantok and Lodant mentioned the Ganahela Duxla, the word said before all else. This is a natural law that honors all of creation and how those beings still carry out their responsibilities. And so it's a reminder for us that our responsibility to creation is to ensure the protection of those natural systems for the next 7 generations and beyond. And so water, the lakes, the streams, the fish, they're all mentioned within this Ganahela Duxla. And so it's our responsibility to ensure that they carry on with the work that they're doing and honor them. So some of the barriers to Indigenous conservation or getting involved in adaptation and mitigation comes from this idea of the 4 moose. So the Indigenous Circle of Experts is a group of Indigenous elders and traditional knowledge holders and scientists who meet and discuss how from an Indigenous perspective, we can meet our targets for in Canada for 2030. And so within their conversations, they were talking about, well, we need to address the elephant in the room and kind of figuring out what this elephant is. And so one of the elders in this group spoke up and said, well, in Canada, we don't really have elephants, they're not a natural animal, but we do have moose. And so that really framed the question around what those barriers for Indigenous people to get involved in conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And so the first barrier, our first moose that they talked about was jurisdiction. And jurisdiction and federal levels, government levels. In our community, we have our clan mothers. And so they form the basis for teachings on water and moving that forward. So, but that doesn't apply in another community, right? And how do we figure out those barriers and making sure that everyone's at the table? The second piece would be financial capacity. Who's going to fund these projects? Community capacity. I like to look at our own community. Being the environment coordinator, my background is in anthropology and archaeology. So everything that we do, I'm still kind of learning a lot and getting and coming from more of a community perspective. And then we talk about cultural keystone species and places. And so there are locations and species that have high value to Indigenous people. And the one I think of particular that deals with floodplains is blue ash. Blue ash is an endangered species that we know that grows on the banks of rivers and wet areas, and it has traditional medicinal properties to it. And so we have to find a way to balance traditional ceremonial activities and the restoration of these keystone species and putting value on them. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about was saturation impacts on the Oneida Nation of the Thames. So some of the homes in our community face severe flooding events on a yearly basis. They were built in locations where there's low saturation occurs, causing flooding. And in some of the homes in in one of our subdivisions here, those homes were built with wooden foundations. And because they're in a low saturation point, have annual and even continual flooding events happening. One of my friends who lives there, one of my cousins who lives in this one of these homes, lives in the basement and woke up to a foot of water in her basement, like flowing everywhere, and it destroyed all the stuff in their home. It was kind of sad, and they had to move out for a while till they could fix it. So these are impacts that have been in our community with the flooding. It's not necessarily from the Thames River, but more so from the little creeks, the high or the low saturation points, and those kinds of things.
Gichimigwach, Mark, another information-packed hour that I hope has been beneficial, and I hope that the community perspectives that we've showcased here today help you to understand the importance of including the Indigenous voices and perspectives into this work. We do have a few minutes for questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Brennan to look after that part. Brennan?
Thanks, Carrie-Ann Miigwech, and thanks to our presenters and to the many of you who have joined us here on this webinar from all over Turtle Island. we're very grateful for your attendance here, and we hope that it has been an informative webinar, and would encourage you to attend the remainder of the series. So there's a few questions that have popped up in the chat. I'll just run through them and maybe direct them and open up the floor for our panelists. So the first technical questions related to access to the recording, as well as links to the slides. And I'm just wondering, maybe Emily, if you might comment on the technical details of how participants can access recordings and have access to the slides.
Sure. So the recordings will be available through the Green Communities YouTube channel, and they can be cross-posted through Chippewas or CPIS. And as for the slides, we haven't yet published them anywhere, but we certainly can send them out as a PDF to registrants through the Eventbrite.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Andrew McCaman, who says that he thinks a key issue is that climate change may require amended floodplain maps and strategies going forward. And this presents a good opportunity to protect First Nation communities, as well as resources such as trap lines, rice harvesting, as well as improving relations and incorporating traditional Indigenous knowledge in flood planning. I'm just wondering, Mark Peacock, if you might respond to that comment, if you had anything to add, maybe some insights from your experience on this project or others. And I'd open it up as well to Chris Tasker.
Absolutely. What I think we're trying our best to come up, because of the community's concerns around climate change, to come up with some options and some understandings around that. Climate change is that, it is change. And therefore, what it means is the planning cycle for floodplains is going to have to shorten. We're going to have to do more work to be up to date with our understanding of how our climate and how the rivers are responding. And that's specific to the river and its local condition and its local hydrology. So very important point you're making, but it means that you just can't do a floodplain and walk away from it. You're going to have to come back. You're going to have to make sure it's still valid for the community.
Okay, Chris, did you have anything you would like to add?
Sure. That's a very good question, and a difficult one to respond to. Mark did a great job of responding. We're challenged with trying to figure out how to consider climate change and the updates to the modeling and mapping that we're doing across the watershed. And while the guidance and requirements are out there for us to consider it, there's not a lot of technical guidance on how to consider it. And at this stage of the game, without any better ways of doing it, we tend to come back and say, okay, we take a look at this particular event and say the construction of the new improved West London Dike, for example. Let's make sure that we have some freeboard on it, some extra buffer, if you will, on it, to be able to account for some change in the future as it continues to evolve, and that some of these events tend to happen more and more frequently or be more and more severe for a particular recurrence interval or probability of occurring in a given year, as I was describing it. So it's definitely a big challenge for all of us to consider. Having the models and the maps, the models and then the mapping tools helps us do that, but it's going to be an important thing to keep on top of, and to continue to maintain the products that are developed to describe the flood risks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Chris and Mark, for your replies. And I'll say thank you as well to all the other questions that have popped up in the chat from Kathleen, Chris, Lauren, and Brian. And I am capturing the questions here. And I think just I can hear the doorbell ringing that we're having some attrition in our timeline here. So respecting everybody's time, I think we'll draw the webinar to a close, and I'll turn it back over to you, Carrie-Anne.
Thanks, Brennan. So as Brennan said, we're out of time for questions, but our team has been answering questions throughout the webinar today. and any outstanding questions in the chat will be answered at next week's webinar. So these sessions are being recorded, as mentioned, and will be posted on the Green Communities YouTube page at the following link. And Emily will put that in the chat box for you now, as well as on the SIPS website, and that link will also be provided. For those who missed webinar 1, it has now been posted up on those 2 links. So please give us a few days to get this webinar posted. And note that we will also distribute via email for those registrants upon the completion of the series, along with those presentation PDFs that Emily mentioned. With that, I'd like to say Gitchi Miigwech, a big thank you for attending today's webinar. We would really appreciate it if you took a moment to fill out the quick online survey that Emily will also pop into the chat box. Our next session is next Wednesday, March 9th at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time using the same link. Info you access today. If you haven't yet registered, please consider registering at the following link that again is in the chat box. Next week, we'll be focusing on the hydraulics and how high flows can travel through and potentially flood a community. And with that being said, again, Chimigwaj, again, everybody for attending and the presenters today. And we hope to see you all next week. Bamapi.